tied to the theme of India's competitiveness in science. And in doing this, I'm going to focus on certain aspects of institution building, the very nature of institutions, which is tied in with the idea of competitiveness, particularly in the scientific sector. I speak more not as a member of the scientific community, although I've been in and out in various ways earlier, but more as an observer of science over the last decade and more, as part of a voice of the science studies group, which looks at philosophy, history, and sociology of science. And one of our main concerns has been trying to understand the nature of scientific institutions in India and the relationship to what Indian science is producing and its status in the world. And it is in that context, I'm speaking on behalf of many people who would have voiced much of what I say. So in that sense, I am the carrier of, the messenger of bad news, in the sense that I carry what people have had to say, not just in our institutions, but also in our universities across the country. And what I summarize on their behalf is largely going to be as follows. Very briefly, I want to focus on the idea of excellence, because this is a point which many of us have been making for a long time, which is that if the scientific institutions, if the scientific leadership continues to look at science as if it's an island in a larger culture, they are seriously mistaken. Science is not independent of the larger culture and social attitudes. And in a similar sense, the idea of excellence, one which feeds on to the idea of competitiveness and the excellence of Indian science in the future, is also a culture. And I do not think it's an accident, as many of you will probably agree. It is not an accident that the lack of excellence in our society is manifested not just partly in science, but also in areas such as sports, arts, philosophy, and social sciences. The larger lack of culture of excellence in our academic community is something which I think is extremely troubling. So in order to reflect upon that with a very specific focus, I want to suggest very briefly these ideas about excellence. It is also takes up on what Dr. Gangan Pratap was talking about, individual creativity. Individual creativity, unfortunately, does not lead to institutions of excellence. And if we need a scientific community which exhibits a great degree of excellence, it does not come from individual great creative leaders. While individual creative leaders are very important, the idea of establishing institutional structures which promotes individual creativity is of fundamental importance. And it is in that sense, I'm also reminded of Gandhi, after Professor Rao mentioned him. It is, we need to reflect for a second on Gandhi, who led by inspiration, who led by leadership, but whose institutions left in his name are in great, terrible shape today. There are very few of Gandhian institutions that have been able to survive in contemporary society. People have argued, who have looked at Gandhian studies, as some of us have, that the problem has been in transferring individual vision into an institutional vision. And so what we would want to do is to have great creative scientists, but who do not go the Gandhi way or the Gandhian institutional way. And that's what scientific institutions do very well. And one of the important aspects of the institutional role, especially in the Indian context, is the institution always is something more than the sum of the individuals. And this in the Indian context becomes what I think is a troubling factor when I will talk about it, that the institution has to be something more than just a selection or a collection of good individuals. While people have talked about creativity, we always hear that there is no rule for being creative. You cannot create an Einstein in one day. But on the other hand, institutions can be created. Institutions can be rule bound. Institutions can have an algorithm for creating them in the model of excellence. And very quickly, one of the primary purposes of the institutions in this sense is as an enabler in a very fundamental sense. And I just also want to point very quickly to the idea of what institutions play in order to support excellence, which is the osmosis and the networked examples. And the simplest examples to me come from the great scientists themselves. As people who have looked at history of science know very well, that scientists such as Einstein, Hilbert, Hardy, for example, I'm speaking of them in a particular context here, were inspired and driven by a larger culture of excellence. Some of their prime peer groups with whom they engaged in a dialogue, who made a significant difference to their work, consisted of philosophers, whether it was Frege, Russell, and others. And they were very deeply influential in allowing these scientists to create their own understanding of the world. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that the notion of excellence cannot be restricted only to science. It feeds off a creative group of people in larger disciplines which are related to it. So now I come, and in all this, I want to come back to the emphasis of the importance of teaching and liberal arts. And here, it's very useful to remember that the anthropologists and cultural theorists who talk about culture talk actually about the idea of learning and teaching as one of the fundamental aspects or characteristics of culture. In the context of Indian institutions, and again, as I said, this is something which I speak on behalf of a large number of people in various organizations and universities who have felt that this particular issue which I'm going to talk about has been a great impediment to the development of a very fertile scientific culture in India. And I just leave this in front of you for a source of reflection. The first point has been, and repeatedly I hear this from many other places, which is institutions in India are not able to function as institutions. The individuals in institutions seem to play a predominant role within Indian institutions in comparison to an idea of institution as a whole. And related to this is the other point which I began with, that science is part of a larger culture. So the cultural parameters of our ordinary life reflects itself in scientific institutions. How we are outside the scientific communities are also in some senses reflected in the way we behave. I think very briefly Professor Rao may have mentioned that. And therefore, what I want to talk about is this, what people perceive as one of the most important problems of Indian institutions. And that is the idea, the belief that institutions in India are personalized. That there is the institutional character of India, in Indian institutions become an exemplification of a personalization of institutions. And when we talk to people across, whether young or old, etc., I don't think it's a problem of age here. Repeatedly people mention the very important role, the idea of hierarchy, and I put feudal in quotes because feudal is a very powerful word, the importance of hierarchy within institutions. And whether it's from students or faculty, the feedback we get from them is that the hierarchy is essentially an impediment to the creation of excellence in scientific institutions. And as I said, these are beliefs held by a large number of people, and methods of evaluation of it I leave. I don't want to say anything on the methods of evaluation of it. And personally, of course, I think this particular idea impacts very much on students. Again, as many of you might have experienced, we feel that there are fundamental problems about Indian students and their way they respond to their PhD work, or their ability to transcend various limitations which they have vis-a-vis their PhD guides and others. There's also been another, I would say this is a very caustic comment on Indian scientific institutions, and I'm brave enough to put it here in the sense, because I see this as an open forum for discussion. This is that Indian institutions have largely been claimed, and I include not a very good scientific institutions here, but I am broadening the scope of our scientific institutions in general, that they are not only paternalistic but they are also paternalistic. The basic idea which people seem to respond to, which the faculty and the students think capture an essence of these institutions, is that there's a preference not for independent thinkers but nodders, what we've called as yes men or yes women these days. There is also a strong sense of belief that whether it's a scientific administrative agencies or with its administrative structures within institutions, that ideas such as jobs and salaries are very often given as individual favors rather than as institutional mechanisms. And this is something which repeatedly is what we hear from our scientific colleagues, which is that the depersonalization of a scientific institution needs to respond to these infrastructural and other support you give for the scientists, not in terms of a personal individual relationship, but in terms of a depersonalized institutional structure. There are people who might say that the reward system is also similarly biased. Very important aspect, which is again very commonly manifested, I think, in many institutions, is that the idea of there is really no culture of dissent. There is no mechanisms for a dialogue on dissent. And it's again a reflection of the personalization of institutional structures, which is that we dissent if people disagree on whatever there is to be disagreed about the system, it gets personalized. And this, to us, there's a very important aspect of this, is that the model which seems to have overcome some of these institutional problems have been what we call as the best models in the world, whether it's the top universities in the US or elsewhere. And therefore, we have forgotten what Gandhi said, and something which is very close to many of our hearts, is that when you dissent, you're not dissenting against a person, but against a system. And that mechanism of incorporating a culture of dissent in our institutions is also very sadly lacking. The other very important point is that, which again reflects a lack of an institutional culture in the country, is the fact that we do not network institutes. We do not create consortiums like the best examples from the US have done. I was talking the other day to a very well-known American mathematician who had visited NIAS, and she was talking about a project of which they were doing some experiments on, on forest. So what they have done is a group of universities and institutes, about 6 or 7 of them, have joined together and they create a forest reserve scheme. Now, if you look at any scheme, any larger project in many of these top institutions, they work because through a very strong networking consortium mechanism. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but the networking of institutions and consortiums again function in our institutions on a personal relationship model. How people relate to each other. How people relate to each other is not how institutes should relate to each other. And finally, I think in many senses, this reflects a crisis of confidence which stares many of the faculty and students. And to me, it is well captured from the defeat from jaws of victory syndrome, which used to be and which still is very much a part of our cricket team. Finally, since this short focused meeting was also to suggest very specific examples, specific measures to deal with this, the fundamental point which I would like to emphasize here is when you reform the institutions, most importantly, the notion of institutionalization involves the ideas of transparency, uniformity, and consistency, which again, I think Indian institutions in general have had a problem setting in place. And we have models for it. It's not that there are no models which have done this throughout the world. And these are the best institutes by any ranking. And why is it that we're not able to transfer that model when we have a working model which reflects transparency, uniformity, and consistency? In the Indian context, there's a fundamental problem which arises over and over again, which is the problem of the human face. And in the morning, I was talking to Professor Simha, and he said that we don't want to be like the Americans, because there is something which we do to our Indian students, which is a human face to it. I don't know whether when Indian scientists respond to the notion of competitiveness, do we want to say we are better off, or that this idea that we are little more of a human face in our institutions or of social justice should actually give us better indicators. That's a problem which I think the scientists are far better to deal with. So, and the other suggestion obviously is to be the most important thing which we need to do right now, whether it's of institutions, and I include universities in this, is to establish a very powerful network. We have had so much difficulty in establishing networks which access library facilities. In India, it's a much more difficult thing than some of the best and the richest American universities have been able to do, but we have not been able to do. And finally, as very specific plan to all of us, to many of us who think that the universities are the hope. The future of Indian science is not going to come from 10 or 20 selective institutions. And we cannot recreate the universities. There has been enormous effort and money put into the universities. And if we wash our hands of universities and say we have nothing to do with them, we have no capacity to recreate the other 200 universities. And we neither can change them. It's beyond politicians, even a politician's desire. So what we can do is to only work on how to strengthen centers of excellence with universities. How do we strengthen university linkages, programs, interventions, transfer values from institutes otherwise? And one of the suggestions that have been made by people earlier is that people who are either senior and retired professors should actually involve themselves from institutes and so on in enabling the capacity of universities and help them finally in improving the quality. And finally, I would, as I speak for a larger community of science observers rather than just as a practicing scientist, it's very important in our view that you strengthen not just science but academic culture in all disciplines. It's only when you are in a world to which you respond to excellence in various departments, in various disciplines, can excellence in science be possible. Thank you.
I think we could have a discussion now but I will start with a few comments. The answer to the question that was posed appears to be generally in the negative. Listening to Arunachalam, he was emphatic with statistics, and I found that when I listened to Dr. Sumantran very carefully, he towards the end said that 20 years later the answer should be a resounding yes. So I suspect that he didn't mean that it was a resounding yes right now. Dr. Gangan Pratap, in the midst of all the philosophy of science that he presented, brought in the software industry, which is his favorite target. And I think he shares with our former Prime Minister Deve Gowda a real antipathy to the software industry. And I am still getting letters regarding his editorial in Current Science where he took on the software industry. But he used statistics, and I found he used it very cleverly. And came to the conclusion that scientific performance is commensurate with investment, and so that Indian science has done almost as well as the Indian software industry. Here I am reminded of a famous statement, this is either Mark Twain or Disraeli, depending on who you choose, where he said, lies, damned lies and statistics. So I would take the more simple-minded view. The software industry seems to be doing extremely well. It would be nice if Indian science had the same image as the Indian software industry. I think Sundar's remarks at the end, he said he was a carrier of bad news, and I must say that much of what he says I am compelled to agree, and in my present position that's quite a confession, because I used to write whatever I liked when as editor of Current Science, and I didn't have any restraints on me. Now I suddenly find myself shackled and thinking twice before I say anything, especially when the press are around. He did say that we must encourage a culture of dissent in the institutions, and I sort of agree with him, because many times we tend to go in the wrong direction, and we don't have the time to listen to someone who says maybe there's some other direction in which we should go. But I think practically there were some very important suggestions which were made. I think one should think about them seriously. I think the Scientific Advisory Council to the Prime Minister under Professor Rao has been very active in actually doing things. And I think one or two of the suggestions which came out merit very serious consideration. One of them is this idea of having an observatory for science where we do monitor the indicators of science on a periodic basis. What was the National Center for Science Information at the Indian Institute of Science now has become a part of the institute and is doing a little bit of this. And I suspect that looking at performance indicators is very important. However much we don't like citation indices, journal impact factors, and so forth, they still are a measure of performance in basic science. We may question exactly how we use the numbers, but I just want to draw your attention to a new measure which is for individual scientific performance, which has been posted on the archives which the physicists use. And this is a paper written by a physicist. So when you look at this paper, it's full of integrals and equations and what have you. But when you look at it finally carefully, you find it's a set of simple formulae which provide you a measure called the H index. And this H index now allows you to measure individual scientific performance. Now, institutions sort of recede into the background here. And really what this measurement is, that we are, I think, today being carried away by an odd paper which appears in a journal of high impact. And I don't think Indian science's ultimate evaluation is going to be done by one paper in Nature or another paper in Science. But I think both quantity and quality must go together. It's like winning one-day match and then losing all the others one after the other. So just as in cricket, we do worry about averages a little bit, we worry about consistency a little bit, and we worry about performance over a long period of time. I think we need to do that. And I think these new measures, quantitative measures which are being proposed in the literature, do allow you to do this with respect to individuals. So if an individual has performed over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you can see this very easily in these measures. Now the real problem with our institutions is I was struck by one fact, that the word oasis were used by different people. So somehow this imagery of a desert is uppermost in everybody's mind, and suddenly you come upon this little oasis. Unfortunately, even in our institutions, and I must confess here, and Professor Rao is here, the Indian Institute of Science is no exception, that even within the Indian Institute of Science, you will find the oasis example now becoming very clear. This is something like those fractals. You see a pattern, you go further down, you see the same pattern, you go further down, you see the same pattern. So what you see for the country, eventually also at a lower level, you can see at the level of an institution, you can see at the level of a department, and so forth. So we don't have a large number of very consistent performers within our system, and there are a very large number of people within the scientific, in the academic science system, which I'm saying, who are in fact not performing to the level that they're doing. And I think this came out very clearly in what Professor Rao said, that there must be a greater output. And I think one of the dangers now with the journal impact factor is that sometimes quantity is being derided, and I suspect that the absence of quantity does not immediately imply quality, and this is something that one must keep in mind when one is looking at scientometric data. I think this idea of observing science is important, so that we would at least, even if we don't use the observations, we will at least have all the measures in place. The other thing that I would really like to draw your attention to is, I don't know how many of you have seen this India Science report which was released. And you will find that the India Science report actually does not deal with science as I suspect most of us talk about. I was actually, I must tell Dr. Mashelka this, because I was terribly limited, because if I was not the director of the Indian Institute of Science and if I was just the editor of Current Science, I would have sat up all night and written on the India Science report. But if you look at performance indicators, even not only in basic science, but also in applications, in useful science, in science which has a societal impact, I think there are measures which can be used. Whether it is measures of patents, whether it's measures of technology transferred, how much money we have earned, if it is target-oriented science, how much power has the Department of Atomic Energy now produced from nuclear power. There are measures of indicator, there's a measure of performance in each of these. I think we need to take a much harder and more dispassionate view. I think something that Sundar said at the end, I think should touch a chord in all of us. When one does this analysis, one is not criticizing individuals. One is not criticizing institutions. One is only, in fact, just looking at what our performance is now and then setting targets which can be reached. I think there's a very important lesson, I think, which has come from what people have said, whether it's missions or whatever. You need a sort of new energy to come into scientific activity, whatever be the driver of scientific activity. It can be the natural economy, it can be the mission mode driver. But we need to set some targets. And I can tell you one, because some of my colleagues on the faculty of the Institute are here. I've been asked over the last few months periodically, what is the Institute going to do with 100 crores? And is 100 crores now announced by the Finance Minister going to transform the Indian Institute of Science into Harvard or Stanford? And when I'm asked this question, actually this question is being posed to the wrong person, because my answer to that would be an emphatic no, although Dr. Kasturi Rangan has been advising me not to say this in public. But I feel that, one must be, whether it is politicians or whether it is leaders of this country, one must be extremely realistic about what you're doing. You should not set unrealistic targets. Tomorrow, if our target is to beat the Sri Lankans in all the 5 matches, then yes, that is a reasonable target. We can set it and try to achieve it. We must set reasonable targets. The question then is, what can you do with 100 crores? You might do a few things. You might modernize an institution to some extent, but you can't now transform the Indian Institute of Science into Harvard or Stanford with 100 crores, and one must be very, very clear about this. You cannot come back and ask me after 5 years, why is this now not Stanford? It is not going to be Stanford or Harvard. The second thing that one must look at here is, what can we do now and what are we doing now? So the faculty of the Indian Institute of Science, on the other hand, will take the position which is opposite to what the Finance Minister says. They would say that you give us 100 crores because we're doing great work, don't ask us any questions after this. Now, of course, both these positions are completely now unrealistic positions. So I did tell the faculty, and I must say here when I say setting targets, I said we should double the number of publications from the Institute. Immediately one of my colleagues got up from the back of the hall and said, does that mean that that's the target, that we are now going to get this 100 crores of money, and after that we are going to double the number of publications? So my answer to that was, no, you double the number of publications with your existing budget, and now when we get 100 crores really in hand, after all the undersecretaries and deputy secretaries have cleared it, then we will now set a new target. Maybe it will be 8 times the number of publications. But I think we need now to set some targets, and also I think what Professor Rao would like very much, that you need at the end of each of these sessions, and certainly this session, if the answer is no, then we need to ask what's the action point, so that the answer can become yes, maybe not after 20 years, but maybe after 10 years, which would be a somewhat more reasonable kind of time target to aim for. If the answer, which I suspect not many people are going to say yes is, then of course we can all just go home. Thank you very much. I think now we could, you could comment on whatever my colleagues on the panel have said and whatever I've said.
Just a quick observation. About 10 days back, in one of the meeting, Dr. Gangan Pratap gave a paper on status of various countries with respect to space and based on citation. Top 20 countries. And since I've been there in the space for last about more than 3 decades, only one country was as per the expected line. One number US. The rest were all total surprises. France was 5th, and of course India was not there in those 20. Chile, which has not done anything, was 12th. Argentina, I think, was 11th. And Brazil, which has a history of not successes in space, neither in satellite or rockets, was 20th. The point I'm just trying to make is that citation index is maybe a very fine indicator. It's not the final word. We can't depend on it for measuring the level of science based on that alone. The second point I just wanted to bring was, when we are talking of strategy, and I really like that what said about the 1 lakh car. I have an example when we decided in some circumstances to launch one of our satellite, technology experiment satellite, and Dr. Gangan was a key figure in that and pushing us to that. Once we decided, in 2 years, what we did is unprecedented anywhere in the world, and at least 3 key technologies got realized, which are totally innovative, not done anywhere in the world. We have not done much publication on that, but it was something not even thought at that time, just because there was a challenge. People came out with a lot of innovativeness. If we are able to throw challenges, if we have the vision, I think a lot can be done. So I personally feel that the indicators, I do seem to agree, but it's not the final word. We can't say that there's no potential. There is enough potential, provided we are able to channelize by setting, as you said probably rightly, realistic goals. Thank you.
No, here.
I wanted to comment on 2 things. One was about the citation indices, that the discussion was there. I had done at one point some analysis of the relative countries like Brazil, India, Japan, Brazil, India, China, the developing sector, so to say, in high energy physics. And there I had found that, this is referring to, there I had found that India's citation performance was, if not better, comparable to China. The increase in the performance was as good as China, Korea, and Brazil. And there one kind of could go back and trace it to the fact that Indian high energy physics community did participate in a big way in the international effort, and that brought the sort of a different level and visibility to the community. So this is sort of slightly, later we will be discussing this in terms of cooperation and participation in big projects, but I thought I'll bring that relation between the 2 issues here in the discussion of sort of citation, increase in the citation. The second point is that I wanted wholeheartedly to support the suggestion that Sundar made at the end, that maybe really time has come to increase and establish maybe some well-developed mechanisms to increase the interaction between universities and institutes. And for example, in Italy, I have seen, and France, one has seen this, that CNRS, for example, has these professorships at a very junior level, which people go into universities, whereas a national laboratory, a national institution pays for their salaries and their positions. And that seems to have made quite a lot of impact in terms of bringing research back into universities in Italy as well as in France. And I think that is one thing that we really need to perhaps think very strongly about.
Dr. Swati Peramal, here.
Thank you. That was wonderful presentations. I have to admit that I'm completely confused. The reason I'm saying that is that in industry, we don't even worry about citations. We don't worry about papers. We worry about money. How much money is coming out of some aspect of research. And I know this friction between what institutes do and what industry does is completely different. And when we have public-private partnerships, we have this intense problem of convincing the institution where we work with, saying, hey, first file your patent before you publish. But they're rewarded for publishing, and therefore they don't look at its application. I think the time has come where there has to be a mix of both. I think the institutions have to change their mindset at saying, okay, how am I going to get application? And industry also has to look at saying, okay, we need to get more papers published. So that's one bit of a dichotomy. The second was that in my own case, I run 350 scientists, and I'm struggling with the idea of reward. How do you measure performance and how do you reward? And I spent 100 crores last year in just one company, and it's my own money, not the government. So I'm always worried whether I'm getting something out of it. And the point that was made by the last presentation, saying, hey, we should encourage dissent, we should encourage openness, but then you want an institution which has transparency but also has consistency and uniformity. So that completely confused me. On one side we're saying dissent, the other side we're saying let's make it uniform. So how are we going to get reward for an individual who is brilliant or for a team which is brilliant? And then the answer to that question I don't really know till 5 years later, because we don't know whether science will be effective till 5 years later. So I think there's this tremendous problem that everyone has of managing Einsteins. And I wonder whether anyone has a more learned comment on that.
Does what? Yeah. Okay. I was curious, but I don't think I heard any of the panelists mention the question of youth in science. Several comments there. One often tends to think Indian institutions as being somewhat, to lack of a better term, gerontocratic. And I think that's particularly true of scientific institutions. Perhaps the success of the IT industry is somewhat attributable to the entrepreneurs being somewhat more youthful often compared to the scientific institutions. The image perhaps is even because of that. And Sundar mentioned the issue of hierarchy, and age and hierarchy often go together. We are a country with, somebody said, 60% of a population below 35. And often it's said that a person does their best scientific work before they are 20, maybe in their 20s. And it'd be interesting to see how we can channel that youth energy, and perhaps the chaos that Gangan is looking for in creative is more readily available if younger people are given the space and the opportunity to do that, and recognized and rewarded as such, because only when you have a lot of that energy something is going to come out of it, and too much structure, too much hierarchy, and too much control perhaps is not the right thing. I don't know. Nobody commented on age. That's why I'm mentioning it.
Maybe scientific institutions like the Indian Institute of Science, they're predominantly youthful. Most of the people in the institute are students. Even the faculty are predominantly below a certain age. Youth by itself is not a virtue. This is one of and I think this old idea that people do their best work when they are young, slowly as science has become more complicated, doesn't seem to be entirely true. Even in the United States, if you go, the universities have the same kind of age profile as we have. Because, you can't send out professors to the fields after they are 40 or something. You have to keep them on. So there's no organization which can remain eternally youthful, not even Infosys. Because you will see the second generation of leadership now slowly coming into the IT industry. I think Indian institutions are very youthful. Professor Rao will testify here, because IIT Kanpur, when it first started, was a completely youthful institution. And it had a different ambience, there's no doubt. But it cannot remain ever youthful. And this is going to be true of the IT industry.
I would like to make a comment. I think age is not a parameter at all in science. It's an absolutely foolish idea. Not because I'm old, not because it's a foolish idea to relate age and creativity. We have extraordinary creative people who are rather old, and extraordinary creative people who are very young. So we need a mix of people who are committed. That the word commitment I use is, eventually it is dedicated hard work that gives you results in science and engineering. It is not so-called brilliance. Creativity, by the way, also has to be defined differently. It is not, your creativity definition is highly narrow. There are subjects like chemistry and biology where your definition will not work. You see, that is where, I can look at something, that is how it will work, make this compound do that reaction or do something else. That is not included in your creativity. It's a very complex thing. What I am interested in is how to encourage creativity in India, promote creativity, how to promote commitment. More people want to publish. See what China is doing. The brute force method. They are paying $100 if you publish a paper in Journal of American Chemical Society or Angewandte Chemie. $50 if it is in Chemical Society London. They are actually giving money in the last 5 years. That is why you see there is a great incentive. Everybody in China wants to publish. So what I asked my friend who is now who is the president of the Chinese Academy, I know all the so-called who manage science in China. They say, this is a good way to get them going. They are publishing enormously. In some areas like nanoscience, 60% of the world literature is Chinese. Of them, 75% is third rate. But still, 25% is good work. So they know all that. They say, slowly as time goes on, China will become such a powerful country, only publish good work. Now we're not going to worry. Let them all publish as much as possible. See, we probably are in that season now. As Balram said, let us increase quantity of science, engineering. See, we need a lot of good engineers, doing research and development. And as far as evaluation is concerned, at the point you mentioned, that, and also Dr. Balram mentioned, others mentioned, you cannot have the same measure. When publication, impact index is all good for people like me and Balram and all of us who do research, there must be other measures for other areas. There is no question about that. The excellence of Space Department, we know. I don't want to apply impact index for Department of Space or ISAC today. Of course not. I know they are excellent, they are doing wonderful work. So we do different measures. It's all understood. See, somehow my problem is how to get hold of a large body of committed individuals who want excellence, who really worry about excellence, independent of their age, institution. And once you get excellent people, the institutions will do well. The problem is, when there is minimal, marginal excellence, institutions decay. That is what has happened to all our good institutions in India. Even India is society, slowly. It may improve because that is why they recruit young people, so they improve the excellence, improve performance. They go on replenishing the talent all the time. So, unfortunately, all institutions in India have not done that. Universities have not done that. They are decaying very fast. They have decayed, in fact. We are having problems. Age and all, I don't think so. But there's no question, I fully agree with Balram, I think we have to perform more. Even statics, very soon India, for publication, in 1 or 2 areas may publish, but by and large, the amount of science coming, at least in my area, and most other areas I know, chemistry is the biggest publishing area, even there we are not doing well. So it's pretty serious, actually. Anyway, that's something else.
Just to add to that point about creativity and encouraging creativity and bringing the stream, many years ago we all used to watch on Scientific American or television about the MIT programs that students would have, student competitions, robotics, and they would do absurd things, take my machine and throw over your machine. But these were programs that required harnessing robotics, controls, deduction and logic, because these machines had to navigate and find out what they would try to overthrow. Recently, last year, I was at IIT Madras for the Shastra event, and I found that they've replicated this kind of a competition. These competitions are doing a tremendous amount to get people excited about technology, innovation, engineering. I've spent the last 2 days at an SAE convention in Chennai, where again, SAE is involved in student chapters. They're developing vehicles today that will give you 3,000 miles per gallon. These are prototype experimental vehicles which can actually seat a student, and there are student competition worldwide. I think we truly live in a world where the opportunities for science are phenomenal. It's our imagination and our ability to get people to see this imagination and harness that energy that's going to be important. Because yesterday I was faced with the same question. How is the manufacturing industry or the automotive industry going to excite people and compete with the IT, which seems to draw all the bright young people in our country. I don't think it is a difficult challenge at all, but it's something that we will have to work very hard and very creatively. It is going to tax our creativity to bring in the creativity of the students.
Since morning, several times the Chinese example has been mentioned. Now, while I agree that we must sit up and see what we are doing vis-a-vis the Chinese, but I wonder if we also should be oblivious to the fact, and just as the last panelist said, that science cannot be decoupled from our culture, our political system as well, that we should be oblivious to the fact that we have actually two different political systems also. We have to cherish what we have in our country, that is democracy. Now, I want to say the following example, on which maybe we can have some discussion. Before the reunification of Germany occurred, East Germany was winning actually a lot of medals in the Olympics, more than West Germany. But that did not mean that East Germany had better science or even better economic status. So I feel that this issue also should be looked at. Is it that we are being too much defensive vis-a-vis the Chinese? Is there kind of inverse racism here, that the China, like in the non-aligned movement, we are competing with the Chinese, and suddenly we feel that the Chinese have gone far ahead, and are we reacting too much? Or we should also not worry about the fact that we are doing things within a different setup. Our challenges are therefore much bigger, and we must succeed within our present political system, which is the democratic system. We need to break at 1:30, so 2 more comments. And we can have it, I think, even in the last session, because there is time. Yeah, Dr. Vadi.
I wanted to make a rather banal point, actually, in response to some of these. The question about drivers in science was raised by Professor Balram. And while, of course, I'm cognizant of the fact that the question is how to make a career in science attractive in India. And good institutions, good work culture, good rewards, networking, travel facilities, etc. are all very important, actually. But there is one point which is sort of usually not made by people who discuss the so-called human resources crunch, is the huge mismatch of salaries which industry pays and which academia pays, actually. So I'm not trying to say that we are in science because of I am in science because, and many of us here are in science because we were attracted to it, we love it, and we are sort of fascinated and devoted by it, and we share the sort of the general momentum that it is good for our society for development of science. But it is also true that in my experience, a lot of our students are going away from the basic sciences because of this huge mismatch in remunerations between industry and academia. And I think it's very important for us to really address ourselves to this question. It may be a very banal point that we are asking for a salary hike, but actually, if you want to attract a lot of people into science, we should do something about this matter also. Thank you. Can I?
A couple of quick points. Hari Babu, University of Hyderabad. My question is to Dr. Arun regarding the citation practices. I think when we go by the citation index, we should also look at the citation practices of scientists belonging to different countries. I think there is some sociological literature which suggests that as an American scientist has to make sure that he cites all the scientists, American scientists. He may ignore scientists' work, in Indian scientists' work, who may have done equally significant work. because there is a politics of citation. I think we should really understand this. So before using this as the only measure of measuring this performance of science, I think we should look into this literature. That's number one. The second question is, Sundar talked about networking and with institutions, private, public collaborations and so on. There is a need to institutionalize this collaboration. We don't have a norms, set norms which really guide this collaboration. I think the lady pointed out, there is this problem of credit sharing. When a public sector institution collaborates with the industry, how should they share credit? The universities and institutions are under pressure to publish, whereas the industry would like to tell the scientists, look, hold on for some time, don't publish this, this has some patent potential, don't publish this. I think these pressures are also there. We should address these questions. How do we institutionalize the networking? I think these questions should be discussed maybe over the next 1.5 days. Thank you.
Last comment, rather.
Just to substantiate this point about the so-called dreadful bogey of citation index, I'll actually give an example in my own so-called career. One paper I published in the Indian journal, which I think the rumor is published from this part of the country, got citation about 2 or 3. But same germ of idea when published in a Western journal with some collaborators from the West, the so-called citation index went up to more than 50. So there is, quite rightly so, enormous politics in citation, and we should not take citation index as the ruling parameter to judge the quality of our work. I have no answer to how to really judge eventually, but citation index alone is certainly not.
Maybe in concluding this discussion, or Dr. Amrit, you want to say something?
Though I'm Secretary DST, I think I should say something. You know, this year I am triggered by your 100 crores for Institute of Science and what should be the target. 95, when I came to DST, we had about 30 crores budget for SCRC, and people at DST said, go to Planning Commission and get it increased. And I had to justify how much I want and why do I want that. Then I realized my earlier experience in Institute of Physics, Bhubaneswar, I used to ask individual scientists, what do you want to do in the next 1 year? And what do you want me to do? How much in terms of money and non-money resources? And that at the end of the year, I monitor whether he has done what he says he will do, and I clear the same amount next year, or if he wants more, he can get more if he has delivered. And we use the same formula in SCRC. We said how many proposals have been cleared by PEC and how many are waiting because there is no money in the kitty. And you may recall in 1995, large number of proposals will get cleared but will wait for the next year for funding. Clearly we were underfunded. And we used to say, take this as a parameter to the Planning Commission and ask for the money. Today, we are not as bad, but we are still not very comfortable either. I won't say we have more. But what I believe is the following. If every scientist in this country knows what he wants to do, he sets his targets, and if the system can provide him the necessary support so that at the end of it he is ready for a peer review, I think our productivity will go up. We have situations where there are scientists in small universities with 1 lakh or 2 lakh inputs, he will be able to actually do something and publish a paper. He doesn't get that 1 or 2 lakhs. On the other hand, there are also institutions where there is more money and they say, well, what do I do with this money? But the money is to be given, so it is given. So I believe that in terms of resources and targets, the scientist should set individual targets and demand for his resources. We introduced last year the Ramanna Fellowship. Basically with this in mind, you would ask him to set a target, give him the resources. If he performs, repeat it again. And keep on repeating it till he is able to do it, irrespective of age. As Professor Rao says, age is irrelevant here. And then what happens is, Institute of Science will not set a target for itself. The scientists who are working in Institute of Science will set a target for Institute of Science. And you will not say 200 crores because it is 100% more than last year. You say 227 will require because this is what will be delivered. And you also know on paper what you will deliver at the end of the period.
All these people who are not my friends, who are against impact index, I tell you why they they publish too little. If you publish enough, it averages out. You eventually get cited.
Yeah, actually, maybe I will answer this in India itself, because I have also been looking at this a little bit. The problem of scientometrics in India and scientometrics data is that we are still dealing with the statistics of small numbers. If the numbers increase, then these numbers become a little bit more. Right now, it's very difficult to say if somebody's paper has been cited 10,000 times, everybody knows that name already. But if somebody's paper has been cited 10 times and another person's paper has been cited 15 times, you can't really come to the conclusion that the person with 15 is better than the person with 10. We are somewhat in that kind of stage. If the total numbers increase, I think the statistics might become more, many of the other things will get averaged out. I think increasing productivity almost of any kind, right from agriculture to scientific, is not a bad thing. It must be a good thing. And maybe we can break.
There are 2 points. When you published an Indian journal, it got 2. When you published the same stuff with a little additional metal, the foreign journal, it went up to 50. And our friend from the Institute of Science said, the high energy physics community, their citation profile is comparable to the rest of the world, largely because they are seen by the world. The foreign journal was seen by the world. The high energy physics community is seen because of the open access. This is one reason why I have been constantly pleading for open access. Mashelkar was very friendly. He gave me 2 lakhs to run a workshop. But then when I requested him that he should mandate it in all CSR laboratories, he's hesitant. I don't know why. So I think Professor Ramamurthy should do it for all institutions which he funds. They should mandate it. Yeah. Mandating setting up of an archive in institutions in CSIR. Yeah, please. And then Dr. Ramamurthy should do it, because you are the largest funder of scientific research in this country. Tell them whoever receives money from us should put the paper in open access journal or open access archive. If the Institute of Science can have an archive, if the NCL can have an archive, why not other institutions? The whole world can see.
Is it similar to Condiment?
Same thing, sir. Same thing. Same thing. Yeah, same thing. So we can improve the visibility very soon. Forget about, in your case, forget about all these things. Whether CONMAT, NOMAT, you are seen. So like Balram said, you are known. I'm talking about the average guy, the fresh fellow who is publishing today. If he puts it in an archive, it will be seen by everybody. So in the Institute of Science archive is seen by 150,000 people in less than 10 months.
We'll break for lunch now, because otherwise...
One is we have put working groups in place for each of the panels, and the working groups are actually put in place to accommodate the other questions or issues that the participants want to raise, and it has not been accommodated during the discussion session. Please look up the working groups. The people in the working groups are there. Given your points in terms of a chit, and that would be discussed during the panel presentation tomorrow. Thank you. We break for lunch. We come back exactly in half an hour. We have working lunch that will facilitate you all to get back soon.